And we're ready whenever you are, Mayor.
Good evening, and thank you for attending tonight's City Council meeting. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Kathy, would you please call the roll?
Mayor Tulley?
Here.
Councilor Selly? Councilor Powers?
Here.
Councilor Scamperly?
Yes.
Councilor Stevenson? Here. Councilor Trim? Here. Councilor Weaver?
Here.
Quorum present.
And we have consensus of council to excuse Councilor Silly tonight?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Before I turn this over to our city manager, Mr. Cronus, for tonight's presentation regarding the challenges experienced by the city's sewer system during major storm events, I want to inform the public about tonight's agenda. Under the city's municipal code, there's no provision for public participation on special meeting agenda. City Council considers suspending the rules to allow public comment tonight, but by consensus chose not to. Instead, we encourage the public to take the time tonight to listen to the presentation, read the reports that are shared with all of us tonight, and then take the time to share your comments and questions at next Monday's regular City Council meeting. To assist us and you, if you have questions, please communicate them with any counselor or with the city manager during the course of the week so that we can develop the answer to your question and bring both question and answer to the table next Monday night. There will be no city council action tonight. Like you, we look forward to learning more tonight about the wastewater issues facing our community and both short-term and long-term options to address these problems. So with that, I turn the meeting over to Mr. Cronus.
Thank you, Mayor. Much appreciated. Per council's request, we have assembled a group of experts to make this presentation to council this evening and to the public. Before I introduce the experts, I wanted to thank council for their patience in allowing us a couple of extra weeks to put this together so that we could provide a better presentation to you and to the public. So I'd like to first introduce Charles Pryor and Abby Doyle. They are with EDR, Environmental Design and Research. I think everyone here knows Carrie and Christian from the Development Authority. And we have, and thanks for Andrea and Shane joining us this evening to add some context. Together, this group has the subject matter expertise to provide you with the best available information. Tonight, Charles is going to begin by describing the existing system and regulatory requirements, and we will end with some action steps council may wish to consider to address the situation. The team did produce a PowerPoint handout, and that will be helpful for you to follow along with. And for those who are viewing this at home, you have access to this as well. Charles, feel free to get us started, sir.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's been a few moments since we've been up here. Welcome to the council, City Manager Cronus. We're going to spend quite a bit of time tonight talking about what exists underground beneath everybody's feet here in the city with your sewer system, and more collectively, it's around the regulatory compliance with a document that was produced long before I was standing up here talking with you folks, and many of you may have been involved with council about your long-term control plan. We'll take a few minutes and talk about that. The stakeholder group that City Manager Cronus had mentioned got our collective thoughts together over the last kind of couple of weeks to really make this very educational to all members of the city. And thanks, Kathy, for helping guide us along here.
Sure.
Appreciate it. Next slide, please. So tonight's agenda, we're going to talk about your existing system and regulatory compliance matters. Going to touch on a few minutes about some of the previous city projects. The city's had a very strong history and initiatives on capital investments into your wastewater, storm separation, all things collection systems. There's obviously quite a few recent and still current projects that are underway, so we want to make sure we talk about them in the right context of where we're at today and what we know as regards with the recent wet weather event. And I say recent, rains all the time, obviously, but you know, that weather event of June 20th and the results of that expressed by the public at the meeting following, that is why we're here today, is to share some information. Next slide, Kathy. So your existing system, It's what we refer to as a combined system in the city. So a combined system is defined as it conveys both sanitary and stormwater. Say sanitary, we use the term wastewater interchangeably, with that. Stormwater is what's generated from wet weather events, albeit rain, snow melt, and that gets into your system through multitude of sources with direct connections within, as well as generated by surface runoff. When they say direct connections, these are things such as a catch basin. There's a photo here along State Street of a catch basin, or the state refers to these as drop inlets that collects stormwater and routes it away. Once it gets underground, it kind of is one of those, could be an out of sight, out of mind thing, but sometimes these pipes are connected to your sanitary pipes, and that's what the combined sewer system conveys. So other sources of the stormwater include sump pumps, roof drains, footer drains, and then obviously from the surface runoff during these wet weather events. Primarily generated through impervious surfaces, talking your asphalt, concrete, roofs, things of that nature. The city's system does have limited sewer separation. We got some maps a little later on to display in some of the projects that show where that separation is, but suffice to say, it's insufficient for intense wet weather events such as what occurred on June 20th. So what occurs during those intense wet weather events, the system capacity can be reached and overwhelmed, and the system relieves itself. And that's what occurred on June 20th in several locations, unfortunately. Next slide. The city has a permit with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and this permit does a lot of things for the city, what you can do to stay in terms of regulatory compliance. However, it permits the city to discharge combined sewer overflow to both the St. Lawrence and the Oswegatchie rivers. You folks have had this permit in place, I think, since the early 1980s formally. There are 17 CSOs located throughout the city. There's some that discharge to the Oswegatchie River, some to the St. Lawrence River. Typically on days like today, when there's no wet weather events, these CSOs are dry. There are periods of intense wet weather events when the system becomes, capacity becomes breached. These overflows, what we call activate, which means they relieve the combined system, and that's the relief point, and they discharge to the adjacent water body. The permit, while it says a lot of things, it requires several best management practices that require a tremendous amount of operation, maintenance, oversight, administration, and reporting. So just to walk through, quite a few of these. They require routine inspection and maintenance. They require the city to maximize the use of the collection system. There's an industrial pretreatment program requirement involved. The city is not permitted to have dry weather overflow, such as a day like today. If there's an activation of your CSO, that's what we call a reportable event to the DEC. The city has to have in place a wet weather operating plan that describes the procedures that will be undertaken during wet weather to comply with maximizing the use of the collection system and only activating the overflows when necessary. It has requirements in there that talk about if the city initiates a project to do combined sewer replacement or extension, how to comply with that with the DEC. You have to submit, annual reports, regular reports, and report through the NY alert system during activation of CSOs. And very important to this is the city's compliance with your long-term control plan. I'm going to spend a few minutes on the long-term control plan here in just a moment, but suffice to say, there's a tremendous amount of work starting in about early 2000, 2007, 2008 that went into the development of the long-term control plan, and still compliance with the requirements of that are active and underway even today. We'll talk about that here in a moment.
CSO stands for
Combined sewer overflow. Yeah. You'll see the photo on the screen there on this slide. You may see these signs. The city's required to post these signs conspicuously to the public at each of the CSO locations, throughout the city. So if you're walking along, say, Maple City Trail, you may see one of these, along there. That's just one of the discharge locations, and there's 16 other ones that look just like it elsewhere. Next slide, Kathy. So on the screen are some images of what these CSO structures look like. They're underground, typically within a manhole or concrete vault that has some shape, some structure to it. I know it's not the easiest to see in the photos, but basically what they allow to do is for normal dry weather flows to stay within the system. And then once the flow level reaches a certain height, it overflows a piece of concrete, a piece of metal, a weir as we refer to it. And that goes down in a different pipe that relieves the system to the adjacent waterway. So these all have different shapes, forms, structures, dimensions, sizes, to them that are located, all underground, throughout the city. Next slide, Kathy. So this slide shows, I mentioned the 17 CSO structures. Your collection system is broken up into what we refer to as sub-basins. So each of these CSOs is assigned to one of your 17 sub-basins. This is a map from 1981 when the CSO structures were developed, engineered, and implemented, around the city. So you can see which ones discharge to the Oswegatchie River, which ones discharge to the St. Lawrence River, and also get a feel for the size of the area, within the city as to what that sub-basin occurs. That basically means within those sub-basins, a drop of water within that sub-basin will be directed towards, if it's a combined sewer overflow, out that assigned sub-basin overflow number. So, for example, the largest area in the city is sub-basin 002. We commonly refer to that as the Elizabeth Street sub-basin. And you can see the discharge of 002 overflow goes to the St. Lawrence River, to the north of that sub-basin. Next slide, Kathy. So another map, a little more kind of hopefully clear as to where the locations of these CSOs are, located, right on water bodies where they discharge to. The one near the boat launch at the end of Patterson Street is number 1, 001. That's a combination of many different flows from the city, the treated effluent from your treatment plant, an overflow coming out of Patterson Street, stormwater collected along Patterson Street, many different flows combined into that one. That's one of the primary ones, in the city as well. That's a very important one, I should say. Next slide, Kath. So the city has a pretty strong history of, knowing the opportunities in front of them to make improvements to the system. So they completed several projects. The documents that we have in-house show going back to the late 80s with the Proctor Avenue sewer separation completed in 1989, followed by several streets through the 90s into the early 2000s, and even some upsize of pipes completed in the early 2000s along Elizabeth Street, State, and Franklin there. In 2012 was a pretty pivotal moment in the city's collection system history, which was the adoption, let's call it acceptance, of the long-term control plan by DEC. The long-term control plan outlined a series of projects for the city to comply with the federal mandate of what we call 85% capture. Basically, this means that 85% of your combined sewer overflows have to be treated at the wastewater treatment plant, and you're allowed to essentially overflow 15% of that. So there are some studies done leading into that to identify what percent capture was being captured at the time. This goes back to 2007, 2008 timeframe, through a significant effort in doing a lot of flow monitoring in the system, as well as a lot of sampling for water quality throughout the water bodies, as well as wastewater, the combined sewer overflows that were discharging to those water bodies. Out of that, it showed that on the Oswegatchie discharge basin, it was showing about a 90% capture rate. And on the St. Lawrence side, it showed about a 75% capture rate. So at the time, there were decisions made, studies done to show the focus of the efforts to comply with your long-term control plan to increase the percent capture within the St. Lawrence discharge basin, which has been the targeted approach and outlaid in the long-term control plan and being implemented since the 2012 timeframe. So following the long-term control plan, more investments were made as the last two items on this slide, that being Patterson Street sewer separation and CSO weir modifications, were to identify capital improvement projects for the city to complete to provide compliance, a path to compliance with your long-term control plan. So those jobs were done in 2015 and 2016, respectively. Next slide, Kathy. So moving forward, starting in the summer of 17, the city commissioned an engineering study to make various improvements at your wastewater treatment facility. This has long been talked about and discussed here, with council. But part of that project was the last project for compliance with your long-term control plan, which was the construction of a combined sewer overflow storage tank, which you see in the photo here in the background at the wastewater treatment plant site. Along with that was a combined sewer overflow pump station, which was located at the intersection of Elizabeth Street and Riverside, which was constructed and is in operation, today. In conjunction with that, other collection system improvements made along the way were upgrades to the East River Pump Station across the street from Smugglers, as well as the Main Street Pump Station, which recently just went online after a major rehabilitation back about a month ago or so now, and the project's kind of wrapping up. Along with that and in parallel, the city completed consolidation of their wastewater with the Village of Hewelton. The village's pump station went online in late 2023 in December. And then in progress today are two very important initiatives to the city. One is your post-construction compliance monitoring. This is the final step of your long-term control plan. Now that all the capital projects that were identified have been implemented, the city's required through your Speedies permit to provide compliance with the DEC's requirements to go back into your collection system and implement flow monitoring again, do various water quality samples again, and compare the post-construction results to the pre-construction results, with the goal being to see what the percent capture is across the city during what they call an average annual rainfall year. A plan was developed fall of 2023, reviewed with DEC. After some back and forth, they accepted the plan with an implementation start date of May 1st of this year. Council took action earlier this year in order to start that compliance monitoring plan. It did get underway in accordance with the schedule on May 1st. It's ongoing, today. What this means is each one of your combined sewer overflow facilities in your system has a temporary flow meter in place to monitor these wet weather events, to understand how much combined sewer overflow is being discharged through them. In conjunction with that, we're gathering rainfall data at a gauge that's located at the wastewater treatment plant site to compare rainfall data versus your CSO and correlate all of that data. Our period for data collection is up at the end of this month. We'll have 3 periods worth of combined sewer overflow and rainfall data. We will then be going back to quote unquote crunch the numbers, analyze the data, see what it tells us relative to your percent capture. That'll be summarized in a report probably towards the end of this year that we'll discuss with the city prior to submission to DEC, which that deadline is March of next year.
Charles, can I interrupt you?
Sure.
If we go back a slide, it says Patterson Street sewer separation completed in 2015. But it actually combines back together, correct? Right where Lafayette and Patterson are.
Yeah, there's a detail in there, and I would actually maybe defer to Shane a little bit. We weren't involved in that project at the time, but our understanding was when Patterson Street was rebuilt, by all means feel free to jump in on the accuracy of this, but that the street was separated as part of the rebuild and the widening, where there is both sanitary and stormwater, along the length of the street.
I believe from Montgomery north to Lafayette, and then east, south, those portions come back together and tie in at Lafayette. But Montgomery down, I think most of the river is completely separated, and east, south, up, I think it ends its way out into the States Ditch.
Okay.
But there's a portion that does combine back into that.
Said 07.
I know there's folks that are here
01.
that live on that corner, trying to get to the bottom of their own flooding.
Yeah, so Patterson separated. If you go back to that sub-basin map, there's a split of sub-basins up there to 007 and 001. So that detail I think Shane's talking about is about where that split is. North of that, where the separation had occurred, there's a detail in that project as we understand it, where while the stormwater was separated, it recombines in following into outfall 001 along in and around the boat launch area. So the separation was complete, but it's not a separate stormwater outfall to the river.
So when I look at this, this particular page, I wonder, so the ones were near the top, the first 5 bullets, or 4 bullets, are any of those, it says, street and sewer separation, but do they combine back into each other as well, like on Patterson Street, or no? So you got Proctor, you got Berry, you got King, and you got Washington.
I don't believe so.
So they're completely separate.
I know, yeah, King goes out the Oswegatchie. Washington might tie into that 001. The way it goes, Berry, I know Proctor Ave is completely separated. Elizabeth Street does come back together. That's another one that was on there that comes back together at the end. And I think that was, it wasn't, I don't know why they did it that way, but I think that's why it also says they upsize the pipe because the sewer's larger, the majority of it.
To handle it, to try and handle it.
Just for clarity here, is it correct that some of East David goes through 007?
Yes. I think it does.
All right. Yeah, that's why I said 07 earlier.
So then is that accurate if we're calling it the Patterson Street sewer separation? It doesn't sound like that's accurate.
That's why I brought it back
I
up,
think-
because it doesn't, it comes back together.
Yeah, and that's the title of the project.
It did separate. But
On Patterson Street, right. So I just wanted to point that out to people, since this is an informative meeting. And then I suppose we'll probably be talking about, was it East South or East David Street project later? That's going to be completely separate when that project is over?
yes, when it's complete.
Okay.
That'll go out through sub-basin. I think it's on that sub-basin 8 area, Gilbert Street area.
Yeah.
8, is it? 6.
Okay. Good. I'm just, I see people here from different parts of the community. These are the trouble spots. These are the ones we're really trying to address here, one fashion or another. And so I just want to make this as informative as possible.
And I think, Councilor Scampley, just to stay on that for a moment, not because I intended to breeze through it, but on the CSO weir modifications, this is one of the more important projects identified in your long-term control plan, as your permit requires you to maximize the use of your collection system, which means based on the study, some adjustments in the weir heights, most of them were raised up in order to keep more of the combined sewer within the piping in order to convey it to the treatment plant for treatment, which helps your compliance with your percent capture, within your system. So all the targets are working towards this 85% federally required mandate for your CSOs.
Right.
Capture and treatment. Thanks for juggling on. Yeah.
Sure, no worries. And we were,
Thank you for just making that clear to the
You're welcome. Would you mind
Here.
backing up one?
Yep.
So the last bullet on this slide is the city's underway right now with an inflow and infiltration study. I&I is one of the, another term for that, illicit water or, rainwater, stormwater, whatever you call it, that gets into your collection system and informs combined sewer. But the area west of the Oswegatchie is the target area for that, over by with the demolitions going on, right now on that side of the city. The city was able to secure a grant, albeit it was half of the amount that they were pursuing. So the scope of that was adjusted to better align with the monies available for the grant in that area west of the Oswegatchie to the city limits over there. Is currently in a study period to identify potential sources of that, do some investigatory work over there, and develop recommendations. And out of that will come a series of capital project recommendations to implement to remove I&I out of that part of the system over there. The target being a focus on economic development west of the Oswegatchie. Anything to add to that, Andrea? Okay. You led the charge on that one. Persevered through it. Good. Okay. All right, yeah, we can go to the next one. So just to circle back around to the treatment plant project here. So, everybody recalls obviously that city just made a tremendous generational investment into your wastewater treatment, facilities. That included the last identified project for the long-term control plan compliance, That's the big giant tank sitting on the east end of the site out there, along with the stormwater pump station, which is what the photo was of here, in this slide. I think it's pretty important to understand that while the treatment plant project did some work in the collection system, it was limited in scope, as it didn't include things like sewer separation or studies to identify sources of I&I. Those are initiatives that the city's restarting now, as during the treatment plant project, it was a pretty big bite of the apple you folks took, and with the amount of effort we said, it was a collective consensus thought of, let's get to the end of this project and then we'll circle back around, into the collection system. And, timing couldn't have been better or worse, I guess, with the June 20th event, as the treatment plant project just wrapped up late last year and online and working. And then the June 20th event occurred, and we're talking about the collection system again. But I would say, for the core stakeholder group that's been working on this for some time, it's been the consistent thought over the years, which is, yes, we have a lot of work to do at the treatment plant because of your consent order and compliance with that. However, we knew that there would be more work ahead for the city to go back into the collection system to identify these larger sub-basin areas, or identify issues that come up with flooding and the like during wet weather events, and then zero in on those areas and really target them for further evaluation, assessment, and look at short and long-term potential projects there. So the last bullet here kind of highlights that being that new capital planning needed to assess and identify these collection system projects. It's a pretty long road, and we're going to spend a few more minutes on that here with City Manager Cronus and the authority to talk about that. But one more slide here, Kathy, before we transition. So just to share a little bit of information on the recent event, and we got a bit of work to do on this, but this is it's hard to see on the screen for those sitting here. I apologize for that, but the June 20th event was pretty significant. Approximately, this is the record that our friends at the airport had shared with us. We're seeking out similar data from other local rain gauge stations here, but about 1.3 inches fell in under an hour. Anecdotally, at the treatment plant, I think they measured around 1.4 in between 40 and 45 minutes or so. That's a pretty heavy, intense, rainfall event. The data, there's a really nice website out of Cornell that does a lot of work on rainfall in New York at a variety of weather stations, both historically and then projecting forward based on climate change predictions. But it correlates closely to about what we call a 25-year return event, a 25-year 1 hour rainfall event. So it's not insignificant in the history of rainfall data local to the city of Ogdensburg. And you can see on this, I know it's hard to see, but other local weather gauge stations here, Messina didn't record as much. Plattsburgh recorded, I think, a similar event. Potsdam didn't record, anything. And you just get a feel for how localized that event was, and understanding it was a pretty good rain event last week. But I think we're still trying to understand if there were any impacts felt locally here by some of the public who spoke at the meeting on, I think it was June 24th or something like that, just to understand, just looking at this rainfall, just getting some of that boots on the ground information, the observations, information, all factors in very strongly as to identify, where these events are being felt the hardest in the city, so we can target our efforts and consult with the city on the focus for the next step. Next slide, Ken. That does it for me for now, I think. But City Manager Cronus had put together a few slides here. I think that.
Sure. Before I move forward, I'm going to ask Carrie Tuttle to come up. She's going to share some other information and give you some more context.
Thank you, City Manager Cronus. What I wanted to touch base on is just to share some experience that the Development Authority has had working with some other municipalities. We've worked with several municipalities that have gone through similar projects dealing with these CSO issues, similar to what Ogdensburg is dealing with. And one of the things that I wanted to just touch on, and that often comes up at these meetings where we're talking with the boards or the public, is, when you're looking forward at dealing with some of these legacy issues that date back decades, it can be a little overwhelming because the cost of making these improvements can be so significant. And one of the questions that often gets asked of me is, what if we don't do this? What if we decide to delay, or what if we don't have the funding to do what we need to do right now? What are the consequences of that? What are the potential risks? And so I wanted to share some of that with you tonight to start thinking about this. And some of this may seem familiar because you may have seen on the news some other communities that are dealing with this same type of issue, and you may have seen some of those consequences that some of those other communities have faced. So that question about what would happen, what could happen, what are the risks that we're taking if we choose not to deal with this? Well, one of the most obvious things is that there will continue to be collection system overflows. So the types of events that we've seen where we have the untreated sanitary wastewater combined with storm water overflowing in the collection system, those events will obviously continue to happen. That is also correlated with the backups that we're seeing in basements and residents and other businesses where the system is completely overwhelmed. There isn't enough capacity within the system. There's no place for that flow to go, and it's finding the path of least resistance. And in some cases, that might be the street and pushing off a manhole cover. And in some cases, that might be backing up into somebody's basement. That can be cost for the homeowner. That can be cost for the city incurring to deal with the damages associated with that. But another issue that we really haven't touched on yet is the impact on the wastewater treatment plant. So when we have these huge high storm events, it causes a huge disruption in the way your wastewater treatment plant is designed to function. Your wastewater treatment plant is designed to handle 6.5 million gallons per day on average. And what we normally see during dry weather flows is somewhere around 3 million gallons a day. When you have flows coming into your treatment plant that exceed 20 million gallons or more in your collection system, the plant is completely overwhelmed and it can't treat the waste in a way that it needs to meet its permit limits. And so that causes major disruption in your treatment plant. And what ends up happening is the biology in the treatment plant, which are the microorganisms that are there that are breaking down the waste, they get washed out. Or in some cases, it requires us to actually put the treatment plant in bypass because the effluent, which is where the clean water that's treated goes out and kind of combines, as Charles showed you on that map, with your CSO1, that actually can back up into the treatment plant. And so we may at times have to actually physically shut off the valve going into the treatment plant and shut off the valve going out of the treatment plant and basically sit in standby while that storm event is happening and wait until that event subsides and then put the treatment plant back online. Well, what happens in that type of event? Well, the treatment plant is disrupted, which could cause odors, which you may have complaints from residents that when the plant isn't operating properly, that's when we get odors. That's when we have other issues like that. And it could also result in violations that could be issued by either the Department of Environmental Conservation or the Environmental Protection Agency. If we are not meeting those permit limits that Charles showed, where you have those speedies requirements that require you to have this long-term control plan, they also require you to treat your waste to a certain level within the plant. And if the plant operation is disrupted, then you have a greater risk of actually being in violation with your treatment plant process. That could result in fines that are imposed if those issues aren't addressed. It could also result in additional directives from the states or the feds laying out what actions you might have to take to address that, basically forcing you to implement corrective actions on their timeline, not on yours, essentially. The other, I think, equally important thing to think about is the impact that this can have on economic development. And in the news recently, one of our neighboring communities, the city of Watertown, you may have seen it on the news, where they couldn't issue any more building permits because they actually were not in compliance with their long-term control plan. And the state came down on them and said, you have to take these actions. And until you do that, you can't have any more development within the city because that additional development is exacerbating this problem. And so they're forcing them to take action to address that issue. One of the items that the city of Watertown is now working on is implementing what's called an offset control plan. And this is something that the Development Authority has experience with dealing with other municipalities that also have CSOs. But what this offset control plan essentially does is it dictates to the community that in order for you to approve any new development, for every 1 gallon of wastewater that will be put it into your system, you have to take out some multiple of stormwater. So for example, for one, let's say a new business is coming in and they're going to discharge 100 gallons per day of wastewater, just to make the math easy. The state may say in your offset control plan that you have to take out 400 gallons of stormwater before you can approve adding that new connection. This can be very detrimental to economic development, as I'm sure that you can imagine, because if you have a development that's coming in, they want to come in likely right away. Getting the stormwater out can take time. These projects are complicated. They need to be designed in advance. And so this could delay and possibly result in economic development that doesn't happen. Those developers may say, you know, for a large development, you don't have the capacity. We're not going to build here. We're going to choose to go someplace else where we don't have to deal with that issue. So that is definitely something to keep in mind. The other item that I think is equally important and related to that is the impact that this may have on tourism. So these CSOs, you know, are creating these overflows in areas where you have public that are recreating. This could be near your beaches. This could be where you have boating activities happening. And these overflows are resulting in untreated mixed sanitary waste with stormwater being discharged. We did a lot of work in the village of Clayton, who also had a long-term control plan, big tourism community, very similar waterfront, had a huge initiative to improve their waterfront. One of their CSOs was right on Riverside Drive, right where their public marina and docks were. And when there were wet weather events, the material that wasn't treated discharged right into this prime area where they are trying to get tourists to come into the area. And so business owners and the public, you know, really wanted this fixed. They wanted that they, you know, basically decided that this is not acceptable for them to have these overflows, even though that was a permitted overflow. As Charles said, the city has a permit and it allows you to discharge a certain amount of material. But that still may be problematic for you as a community in your vision of where you want to go with tourism and these areas that you're trying to develop along your waterfront. So I would just encourage council to think about your vision for the future and where you want the city to go and the impact that some of these CSOs may have on your long range plan for the future and where you're trying to head with your waterfront revitalization and economic development. And, you know, just learning from some of your neighbors and those issues that they also dealt with. The other sort of related factor to that is the impact on property values. So, you know, if homes are having backups or if their properties are located near these CSOs, you think about, I'm looking at you, Jennifer, you're a realtor. You obviously know how types of factors like this can affect property values. These types of things can definitely affect home values. They can affect the resale value of your waterfront when you're trying to develop. So not just operational issues, but sort of future potential for economic development and economic growth. And I'll leave you with sort of the key takeaway that I've seen just with our experience over the last 10 plus years working with communities is that this is a marathon, not a sprint. We didn't get here overnight. No community did. They got here over decades. These CSO regulations went into effect in the 1980s. So these are not new regulations, but it's taken decades for the state and the federal government to start enforcing these things. And it's going to take communities a long time also to get out of this. But the first step is setting up a plan and starting to work through that. And I would also tell you that it is something that you can overcome. You absolutely can. And there are many examples of communities that have been through the same sorts of things that you have, and you already have a great foundation to step off from with the work that's been done at the wastewater treatment plant in these prior separation projects. So,
Carrie, just 2 explanations, if you could.
sure.
Could you explain why we didn't build the plant to hold more than, take on more than 6 million gallons? And then could you just talk a little bit about the fines? Because you mentioned the fines, but what kind of hefty fines are we looking at if we did something crazy?
Sure. So if you think about those numbers that I was talking to you about, like say your average flow is 3 million gallons and your plant's rated at 6.5 million gallons a day. If you could imagine designing a treatment plant that was 4 times as big or more than what your current treatment plant is, that means 4 times the capital costs. That means 4 times the operating costs. And that means that you're basically trying to run something that can run at these very low flows and at these very high flows. It's not achievable. So you can't practically build something that would be feasible that could handle all of this wastewater. That's why you have CSOs, quite frankly, right now, and all that flow isn't getting piped to the treatment plant because the size of those pipes and what that would take would be astronomical. There's no way that the city could afford to do that. So around the cost aspect, though, we didn't really touch on this. It is important to think about all of this stormwater because only 85% of it has to go to the treatment plant. So only 15% of this is really what's allowed to be able to go out through these CSOs. That's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of gallons of water that you are not required to treat, that you are pumping, adding chemicals to, spending labor, managing all of this, going through your treatment plant processes. This is costing you money to treat stormwater that you are not required to treat. But we don't have a way to get it out of the system because these areas that are combined, the pipes in the ground are not there to allow the stormwater to just be discharged without commingling it with the sanitary sewer. So in the long run, when you think about this, separating these stormwaters is going to save you money in the long run because you're not going to be spending money pumping and treating and managing all this stormwater in a way that is not required to be managed by the state.
So basically, the day that we had that big event and, we have normal 3 million gallons of waste that come through, but then we had, how many gallons do you say, 20?
Yeah, I think we had, was it over 20 million gallons? 22 million gallons. So,
the rest of that, other than the 3, is basically stormwater that was coming at us.
Yes, absolutely. Stormwater, right. And that also is, again, very hard to treat because the biology in the treatment plant, if you think of the treatment plant, it's kind of like your digestive system. It likes to be fed frequently, same size meals, kind of eat, and that's how the bugs in the treatment plant work. So when you get these huge events like this, it just upsets all of the biology within the treatment plant, and we have to kind of go into protection mode, try to save the bugs that we can, and then it can take weeks after these storm events to get operations back to normal. Also, it is very disruptive to any wastewater treatment plant. That's not the way facilities run well. And that creates odors and that creates compliance issues and all of these other things that we mentioned previously.
And touch on the fines just a little.
Yeah, so fines really come into play if you end up getting a consent order. So if you are not in compliance with let's say as a result of this new post-compliance monitoring that we do, that you're not meeting your capture rate of 85%. Then you will have to update your long-term control plan and identify additional corrective actions that are going to get you to that 85% capture rate. If you don't do that, then the state will issue a consent order or an administrative order, and they will give you a compliance schedule, and they will dictate actions that you will have to take by a certain time frame, and they can impose fines at that time. Consent order fines can really vary widely. Typically, we see somewhere between $25,000, $100,000 for a consent order with a schedule of compliance. And if you don't meet those scheduled compliance dates, which will require capital investment, which also may put you in a really bad position where you don't have time to go get grant funding, because now you're on their schedule and you've got to spend the money, or you're going to risk, I mean, they could be up to $1,000+ per day they can fine you for being out of compliance. So the fines can definitely be very significant. Typically, you know, you don't want to be sort of getting backed into a corner, really, if you get to that point where they're telling you what you have to do and when you have to do it by. You really want to be more proactive to try to maximize the amount of grant funding that you can get to offset these capital investments, and there is funding that's available to help with these projects.
At the conclusion of this year's long-term control plan, if we're not meeting those, we could be in threat of a consent order. If we're not meeting the requirements, 85% capture, or
You could,
yeah,
typically, so if that does happen, then we will be working very closely with you all to help identify what those next steps are. You know, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the original long-term control plan and where the data come from, but I do want to just mention, you know, we talked about this in our workshop that, you know, your CSOs aren't metered. And this is based on modeling. This is very complex, the hydrology and the hydraulics of how the system works. And so when the engineers are completing this type of work, you know, they're taking data over small periods of time and they're making assumptions. And they're doing the best that they can to sort of predict what's going to happen. But because we don't have real-time monitoring data at all these CSOs, it's the best guess of what we think is happening. And the intensity of these storm events and the frequency of these storm events also are based on historical data. And as we've all seen, especially this year, we've seen things that we have never seen before. I mean, look at what's happening in Lewis County right now. Yeah. You know, with the flooding, they still have several bridges and culverts that are out. They had 6 inches of rain in a day. So these are certainly not what our systems are designed to be able to handle. And if these events continue and they're in their intensity and the duration of the events, it's going to wreak more havoc on the system. And I think we are all seeing a trend in that direction, that the intensity of these storms is increasing, which increases all of these risks that I'm mentioning here for your system.
As we discussed in that workshop last week, you know, Andrea working diligently on these East David. East David?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say East South Street, East David Street, with that. Is there coming a separation with that as well? Right. So with that being said, as you mentioned earlier and what we discussed in our workshop, you know, we've got a lot of good things working for us right now, and we need to stay on top of that and to continue moving forward so that we can get a complete separation.
Yeah, absolutely.
For these troubled areas.
Yes.
First, and then address the outliers.
Yep.
Okay, anything else for Karen?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. So the team got together and put together a high-level roadmap for improvement, and I wanted to go over that with council and members of the public. I think what we've heard tonight, and it was certainly echoed during our workshop, was we don't have a wastewater problem per se. We have a stormwater problem. Right? Recent events that have been made in the city, including the wastewater treatment plant, have been good for the city overall and good for its infrastructure. However, what we're asking our system to do is to process more than it can handle at times. And that's because we have that combined storm and sewer system. The solution, obviously and logically, is to take the storm water out of our sewer system. Next slide, please. And I'm going to ask Andrea and Shane to come up and explain kind of these two maps here. One is of the diagram of the sewer mains, and the other is the storm lines.
They're kind of small to see, but the ones in the green side where it's above sewer is our sanitary collection system. The one on the right side is a stormwater collection system. So you can see the difference in how much sewer lines we have versus our separation. And some of the ones that are up there that are labeled storm lines also do connect back together into the system like we talked about earlier. This is available on the Development Authority's website under GIS, and they have tabs that you can see our whole system, and it updates as we go. So if you look at it right now, Patterson Street's not right. We just got the files to send over, and they're going to update it for us when we get with them. But it'll show everything. It can show you right down to where your water shutoff is out front of your house and in the streets and stuff like that.
Thank you, Shane.
Shane,
Yes.
while we're looking at this map, I know in the workshop the other day, we discussed a sewer line on State Street that runs all the way, or not a sewer, but a storm sewer.
Yep.
Line. And I'm not seeing that on this map either. And that goes all the way to the river, correct?
Yes. I think it's because the state owns it. When they took ours, they took our maps of what we owned and overlaid them into our system. They didn't take the state's.
Okay. And have we had any communication about being able to tie into that?
Not yet.
Okay. Because one of the problems, and the public should be aware, is when we've had new development on State Street recently, the state won't let us tie their storm sewer into that line. Which, am I being correct here? For example, the development.
They did have one instance, which was before me. They told them they couldn't. I don't know why they said no, but I don't know if they're going to say that they're already maxed out. But they did say no in one instance, yes.
Yeah. And so it just seems, at first glance here, without too further of an explanation, unfair that they have a line coming in here, but they won't let us tie into it, and it's overtaxing at the end of Franklin. When we could actually tap into that line, if we could, if it's big enough. So it's too bad it's not on here. And then another question that I had from the workshop the other day, did we find out if the shopping center over by the highway is coming in, all those flat roofs, are they coming into our system too, or are they going into the swale on 37?
I was on vacation last week. So
well, good for you.
So
I know you worked today. You were a very busy man.
Today,
saw
so
you down
I
at the
haven't had a
first
chance
thing
to
this morning.
look into that.
Okay.
Excuse me, Fonda, when we do the minutes from this meeting and we publish them, could we just do the links to these two maps within that? I think it would make it easier for the public that want to see these instead of trying to circumvent everything and get to these. I think it would just be helpful.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Thank you, Shane. So, next slide, please. So why are some homes seeing sewer lines backed up? I think the words on these on this slide actually has already been covered a number of times. I do want to talk about the chart, right? Cornell and Charles actually referenced this with the intensity, duration, frequency curves that Cornell University has put out. And I just want to explain the intensity chart here. If you look at, for example, a storm with 1 hour of duration, from 1970 to 1999, Cornell was able to put an intensity metric of 1.44. Projected from 2010 to 2039, the intensity of a 1 hour storm will go up to 1.54, which is about a 7.5% increase. Projected further out, 2040 to 2069, they project the intensity of a 1 hour storm to go up to 1.66, and that's another 8% increase. So as you can see, the intensity of storms are going out, and as the expert team has talked about, the storms are a problem, and the intensity of the storms in particular are a bigger problem, right? A 1 hour, 1 inch rainstorm in June producing 22 million gallons. We're going to see more of these events and more intense events, and that's going to cause more trouble in the long term. So we need to assess the impact of combining some short-term stopgaps and some long-term capital planning. Next slide, please. So on the short term, we do have some mitigation strategies that we can look at. Obviously, the goal of this totally is to eliminate or mitigate as much stormwater entering the system as possible. So homeowners do have an option. backflow valves that we've talked about. And putting those into basements and into homes can be a lifesaver for those basements. The city can also take a number of administrative actions, and we probably should consider them. Next week, management will bring to council an updated backflow valve program. An event such as this, educating on the public on how they can help, making sure that your sump pumps aren't connected into the sewer system. And some of the other things that Charles mentioned, all can be very helpful in trying to mitigate the amount of stormwater that enters into the sewer system. One of the things the city can consider is stronger enforcement of its current sewer use law that does outlaw connecting stormwater items into the sewer system. We also can update our sewer use law, and I believe that there is a draft that's been worked on for previous council that was tabled, and we can probably blow the dust off that, review it, and bring it back to council here in the present time to perhaps see if we can't improve and strengthen that. We can also identify what we are calling low-hanging fruit. There's probably a bunch of large buildings out there, commercial, government, and rental buildings that could be tying directly into directing their storm sewer into our sewer system, and perhaps maybe we can identify those and take that storm water out of the system. We can look for illegal tie-ins during inspections. We can look at tying building permits and home inspections into doing an inspection for illegal tie-ins. We can consider new criteria for new builds, and we can certainly seek opportunities when we do have street projects to see if it's feasible to separate stormwater from sewer. So those are all things that we can look at administratively on the short term to try and mitigate that. Next slide, please. But obviously the long-term solution is to have two separate systems. And as this chart shows you, this picture, having a dedicated sanitary sewer that will drain right into the waste treatment plant, along with a dedicated stormwater collection system that will drain right into our streams and rivers. And that will most likely take care of it will mitigate stormwater from going into the wastewater treatment plant, needing to use the CSOs during very hectic and crazy storm events. Next slide, please. So I look at this long-term strategy in a couple of phases. The first phase is really a planning phase and prioritizing, coming up with an action plan. And I think the city and its residents need to take a long-term view and consider this plan as an investment in the community and an investment in economic development. This is going to take time and it's going to take money. But to improve the community and improve the opportunity for economic development, the city needs to take this as a long-term view. We need to identify projects, we need to plan for them, we need to prioritize, and we need to put it into an overall mitigation strategy. I believe the city should also be prepared to fund studies and plans and engineering on its own if necessary to be able to do that. It's to the point where we can't always rely on grant dollars, so we're going to have to look to see where we can utilize local dollars when we have to. And I think maybe the most important thing in phase one is to codify all of these projects that these studies identify into a long-term capital improvement plan. We call those CIPs in the business. And along with that, we should have long-term funding plans and long-term water and sewer rate strategies. And this, it integrates everything into one plan to see where we can go on this in phase one. Next slide. And in phase two, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. We obtain the funding and we execute the projects and the plans. We want to look at the individual projects and match them to the funding opportunities that are out there on a priority basis, execute, complete the projects, and measure improvement to show progress. And maybe the most important thing is this is as Carrie says, a marathon, not a sprint. We have to have patience and we have to have commitment. This is going to take time. It's going to take money, both externally in the grant world, but also locally. And it's going to take long-term community support to make this happen. So next slide. Obviously the big question is, so where do we go from here? We've got all of this information and we hear kind of a strategy to move forward. So at next week's council meeting, as I mentioned, city staff will present a modified backflow program to council. I think that's a good start. We should consider implementing the administrative actions that I mentioned in the previous slide, and that will help to start reducing the amount of stormwater that enters into the system. We need to identify first step studies, first step planning and engineering to begin to quantify the priority projects that we need to make. During the upcoming budget process, we should begin to identify revenue sources, especially on the local level, where we can pay for some of these plans and studies. And I think continuing to educate the public on how they can help us is critically important to be able to start mitigating how stormwater gets into the sewer system. I think it's also important to work with the residents that are having challenges to see what we can do to help. And I can't stress enough developing a long-term detailed water and sewer CIP so that we can start mitigating these problems. Again, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And if you don't plan, success just won't be there.
Thank you, Fonda. Questions, comments from council?
Fonda, just to be clear though, it already is not permitted to put your stormwater from your rain gutters and your sump pumps into our system that are combined. It's already not allowable.
That is correct.
But we're just looking at a new plan that would more delineate all of the details of everything and then make steps to help implement that.
Sure. The whole point of the matter is that probably a lot of the public is not aware of that. So getting that word out and trying to give everybody the information and then to trust but verify, right? And making sure that, okay, this is what should be happening. But in instances where we have opportunities to inspect, maybe the answer is to actually do those inspections. And then at that time, if we see a violation, to educate that resident that what you're doing is not legal and here are the remedies that you need to take, and then come back in a little while and make sure that correction was made. Again, every gallon that we take out of the system is going to help the residents who are having trouble right now.
At the workshop, we talked about even our city hall buildings, investigating there and starting to separate those. That would be a good first step, and we need to be in compliance also.
Without any question, though, that'll be one of the first things that we do. Yeah, and all of the larger commercial buildings, and even any of the other government buildings, right? We're thinking schools; those are large buildings too, and they have large parking lots. All of those, trying to make sure that they're in compliance will be critically important, right? The bigger the building, the more offset we can probably gain.
Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else?
I think it's a good first step here. A good, strong first step, my opinion. But there's there's going to be some enforcement. There's going to be some pain for citizens. But, ultimately at the end of the day, if we want to advance this city in any way, shape or form through our planning and anything going forward from it, as Ms. Tuttle mentioned, economic development and tourism, it's vital to us, for us to be able to try and move this needle. And it's gonna be it's not a sprint. It is a marathon, as the city manager mentioned, and there's going to be a little pain on the citizens, and we don't even know some of these flat top roofs. I'm looking at the Dillingham building across the street. We don't know if they're in compliance. We have a sewer law on the books that we haven't enforced, and we're going to have to enforce it. And that's going to come down, and hopefully that'll help alleviate some of the issues. And with a lot of this, it was a good meeting on Monday, and it's, I think, a great presentation here, and look forward to moving on this. One quick question for Andrea, possibly. Somebody had mentioned in the workshop program about the CHIPS program. I think it was Shane, actually. And I think of East David Street, East David Street with the potential restructure there. Is there any possibility of dual grants to be able to assist in that separation, or through the CHIPS program? Did I mistake you?
I think you
CDBG.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. In the neighborhood. Yep. All right. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to the CDBG program, the Community Development Block Grant Program. They have a public infrastructure
component. So it's oftentimes we talk about CDBG with housing or other community development related programs, but they also have a public infrastructure program. It's a great funding source, but you have to be eligible, and eligibility, same with housing and community development, goes back to assisting low to moderate income individuals. And we do not meet the community-wide standard of 51% low to moderate income. And so in order for any of our projects to qualify for public infrastructure funding, you have to do a target area study, basically through to prove that 51% of the residents that will benefit from that public infrastructure project are low to moderate income in accordance with the CDBG income guidelines. And we did that for the East David Street project area. We identified all of the property owners that would connect in or benefit from that project. We did a survey. We followed up by going door to door in order to meet the required response threshold. And one, we didn't meet that threshold because individuals living in that target area were unwilling to complete the survey. And so that's the first thing. So we didn't meet that threshold, but even those that sent it back, which was very limited, did not fall within the income parameters that was necessary. We have, however, applied for WIA funding and WQIP funding, and we have received funding for that project, but we have reapplied for the water portion of that project this year in this current round of EFC funding.
Andrea, could you explain, because right now people are very wary about giving any information out. Somebody's knocking on your door, they want you to sign up for this. Could you identify how those initial requests were sent out for information and what people could expect and what they should ask of someone asking this information if we are able to apply again and try to gather this information?
CDBG has a very specific process and procedure that you have to follow. They have to approve of your income survey, essentially. We do tell residents up front that it is confidential, although obviously somebody has to analyze it, so someone's going to see it. You don't have to include your name and personal information, but we were looking for address, income number, people in the household, etc. That's what we needed in order to meet the minimum threshold as required by CDBG. So we do let people know up front they can provide as much information as they want, but there are minimum things that they need to provide to meet that threshold. And any information that is provided is held strictly in confidence. It's never available to elected officials. And that was made very clear.
Would they get a letter in the mail from the city? Is this how the information is gathered, and who would be going door to door?
I mean, we don't do these things very often. We did it in this case because the target area was pretty small. It can be very, very costly to do these types of studies, but they did receive multiple mailings from the city of Ogdensburg letting them know a survey was coming, explaining what it was. It was followed by a survey. It was a hard copy survey. And then it was also followed up by staff members that went door to door and knocked on every door within. There were only 36 properties, so keep in mind it's not a big area, but we did not meet the threshold of required responses, which is 90%. So
Just to add to that, to Jen's comment, I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, we're going to need the citizens' help here as well. You know, this is it's going to have to be a joint effort, and we're going to need your assistance and help along the way for us to be able to collect information to be able to assist in preventing these issues from happening going forward.
but yeah, until the city of Ogdensburg on a whole surpasses that 51% low to moderate income. So it's a double-edged sword. Obviously, you don't want to be more than 51% low to moderate income, but we're at 50%. And 50? So 50.
I thought you said 60.
And so until we click over to 51%, we would be required to do this level of survey for any public infrastructure. We've had numerous conversations going back to, and I'm sure Carrie can attest to this, with HCR, which is Homes and Community Renewal, who administers CDBG funding at the state level. We have qualifying census tracts. We have projects within those census tracts that's not sufficient. So this is the only avenue for us at this time, is to prove that individual projects benefiting individual property owners meet that low to moderate income threshold. And if we can't prove that and demonstrate that successfully, we cannot qualify for CDBG public infrastructure funding, which is a very big deal because there's no match required, and they provide much higher levels of funding for individual projects than other sources of funds.
Okay, anything else for Andrea?
Dr. Andrew.
Okay. Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks.
Anything else from council?
If we could just talk a little bit about the 1.5 million gallon holding tank and some of the odor issues we're having right now. If we could just address that, the efforts we're making and what the future plan is, just so people can hear that. I'd appreciate that very much.
Give y'all an update on that. There's some action last week actually taken to advance that effort. So the just to take a step back, so your tank at your treatment plant site is 1.5 million gallons. The allocation of that 1.5 million gallons is 800,000 gallons to the city of Ogdensburg. That's the 800,000 gallons was identified as the volume of water as part of the long-term control plan development that you had to capture and store in pursuit of compliance with your LTCP. The remaining 700,000 gallons is allocated to the village of Hubleton as part of the your treatment plant project and with Hubleton study to look at consolidating the wastewater with the city. They paid the capital to upsize the tank from 800,000 gallons to 1.5 million gallons as part of the treatment plant project. So they paid the capital associated with that, as well as funded the pipeline all the way from the village directly to the tank. Since the consolidation has come online in early December, and with a few of the wet weather events that have occurred, an unforeseen condition has occurred, which was the storage of the combination of stormwater and Hubleton's wastewater in that tank for a period longer than what was initially anticipated, multiple days at a time. And this has led to when that material is discharged to the wastewater treatment plant, a couple of things occur. One, it's very odorous material because it's been sitting stagnant. It's not what we refer to as fresh or aerated. And number two, that material is very disruptive to the treatment plant process because it's not, it's very different biologically than what's already in the plant. So it's very disruptive to the operations there. We're under contract with the village on their wastewater treatment plant project. We've identified, did an alternatives analysis to look at options as to keep that material fresh during wet weather events in there. And the village is pursuing the implementation of an aeration system dedicated to the CSO storage tank. The project compared to the consolidation is quite significant for them. They're looking at the project budget. They do have some available grant dollars to commit to that. We actually have an important call with the funding agency, USDA Rural Development, this Thursday at 1 o'clock to walk through that process to get their sign-off commitment on the use of the village's remaining grant dollars towards the implementation of that. In parallel, we're going to have the design of that aeration system done here pretty shortly, probably within a week or two, in order to solicit prices from contractors for that work. So there's a lot of progress on it. Unfortunately, it's not a quick implementation. Once the grant dollars are allocated, dedicated, and equipment is ordered, the equipment's complicated. It's highly specialized due to the nature of it. We figured it's probably in a 9 to 12 month implementation period strictly because of the lead time on the blower package, which has about a 36 to 40 week lead time on it. So we'd be looking at spring of next year, maybe summer of next year. So the authority who operates your facility at the here in the city is taken some form of, I'd call it corrective action, both at the treatment plant with operations and working with the village on their end as they operate both facilities to try and mitigate this to the maximum extent practical. Let's say, implementation, what we call best management practices with the implementation of what can be done given the infrastructure that's in place today. There's not really, unfortunately, an initial very quick step associated with it in order to solve this problem during wet weather events. During dry weather, things are normal. water comes in, goes through treatment plant, gets treated. It's when you get into these storage events like occurred back on June 20th and maybe a little bit last week where material has to be stored for multiple days on end, and it gets disruptive to the treatment operations.
Could you explain some of those corrective actions that are being taken temporarily until we can do a permanent solution?
Sure.
I think the major thing that we've been able to do is really working with the village. On the village's end, adding chlorine at a pretty high rate on the village's end before that flow is pumped to your wastewater treatment plant and stored in your storage tank. We can kind of look at wet weather. We know when wet weather and rain events are coming within reason. We look at radar. We can tell when we're going to have wet weather events. We're going to have to store this flow in your CSO tank. We can contact the village. We can have them increase their chlorine feed rate on that end to try to keep that flow that's going to be held. We know it's going to be held in the CSO tank for a day or 2 days, depending on the intensity of the storm. We can have them add additional chemicals on their end, which they've been starting to do at a pretty high rate as far as chlorine goes, and it kind of helps that flow to not go as stagnant or as stale while being held in your tank before we send it through. The other thing we've been trying to implement more recently is dealing with and directly communicating with some of the municipalities, larger users out there. There are some larger users at the Hubleton side. We're able to actually work with them, and in some cases, some of them have on-site storage of their own tanks or equalization basins of sort, and they're able to hold some of their flow back again when we're anticipating wet weather, keep flow on their end instead of sending the same amount of flow that would have came down to the city when we anticipate rain events. And then we're able to have less flow coming this direction that's going to be held in that tank. So less volume in that tank. Once the storm event subsides, we're able to get rid of that flow at a much quicker rate. I'll also just say that the entire treatment plant has been completely made over in the last multi-year process. There's still a lot of new equipment there, a lot of new processes. Even this tank was just going online just last year, and really Hubleton only came on last December. So there's still a lot of learning processes going on there, a lot of breaking new equipment in, understanding what the capabilities are, and there's a little bit of a learning curve there for sure. But it's all stuff that we're working diligently at. We hear the complaints, we understand the complaints, and we're definitely doing the best we can on our end. And we have these high rain events, and they're that intense, and you have multiple inches of rain over the course of a days. You're going to have to store that flow in your tank. It just becomes much harder to get rid of that. You can't just open the tank and drain the tank over the course of an hour. You wipe your own wastewater treatment plant out, right? You then have to trickle that flow back through your plant. So the longer the rain duration is, the larger volume we have, the more you store, and the longer it is to have to try to push that stuff through your wastewater treatment. So we're a little bit at the mercy of Mother Nature with these intensity of these storms and the volume of rain we're receiving. But like I said, we are making some process changes and working with our municipal customers to try to mitigate that as best we can.
Thanks for the explanation.
Okay. Just to add to that, the village in the not too distant future, they're incentivized to reduce the amount of flow coming to the city as there's a charge associated with that for every gallon they send down the pipe. You know, they're out they're pursuing engineering consultants to do an II study throughout the village in order to do similar work that the city's undertaking right now to identify those illicit discharges of stormwater into their system, and then look at capital planning to implement those as well to get stormwater out of their system as well. They have a couple of sub basins that have been trouble for them in time, so they're undertaking a capital program as well.
One additional question, if you don't mind, while you're there, Charles. So, you know, a lot of talk was talked about the WEIR system in the city. So there's no opportunity for us to do anything different with the WEIR system, or we would totally be out of compliance, and we can't do that during the monitoring process right now anyway. Am I correct in that thought process?
Yeah, so that the LTCP, which was reviewed and approved by DEC, the WEIR modifications were one of the critical projects that were identified, you know, in it. You know, I think in order to go backwards at this time would probably send the wrong signal to DEC, and probably would all but seal the fate of your post-construction compliance monitoring report, that being non-compliance with your 85% capture. You know, I think more importantly is the action that the city's identified, both short-term and long-term, with getting the stormwater out, fully endorse that. And that's very successful now in the communities. Carrie highlighted specifically Clayton to be recent, you know, and very local to the Ogdensburg area. to do that. But to go backwards right now wouldn't be wise. You know, you'd be having to do that much more work, which would be significant in nature in order to comply.
Good. Mike?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So again, as we anticipated, a lot of information shared with the community tonight, you know, dating back into late 1980s to the present. And as to echo comments that have been made by other counselors, you know, this is going to be a community effort on all our parts to do the best we can to try to find some short-term solutions to some of the more immediate problems, particularly as it relates to the backup in the people's basements during significant storm events. But then, you know, the longer term plan that'll have to be developed that we'll count on administration to develop and share with us over a period of time. I would encourage you to encourage your friends to go to the city's website to look at these documents, take the time to watch the video of tonight's meeting. And again, next Monday, before next Monday, over the weekend, maybe take a look at the agenda and see what action items, if any, that the city staff is recommending to council with regards to any short-term solutions or assistance we might be able to provide to homeowners in the city. I want to thank Charles and Abby and thank Carrie and Christian tonight, certainly for your presentations, but for your expertise in giving us the information we need to, and staff needs to have the facts of the situation, and also based on your experiences and knowledge of what's happened in similar nature in other communities, you know, things that we need to be cognizant of as we make decisions going forward that, and again, in the long term, are hopefully going to eliminate the problems we're having with the backflow issues, but more importantly, position ourselves for economic growth. And so with that, if there's nothing else from council, I'll make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you for attending tonight.